Q&A after our next speaker. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Gillian Koh to share with us your thoughts, your perspective on the future of people and society. And can we have a slide, please? Thank you very much.
The clicker?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Good morning, participants of SG50KITAx. Cairo, very good to finally meet you. And of course, it's a great privilege and honor to share the platform with Dr. Fatris. Dr. Fatris, the Mufti, is a very tough act to follow. He's given some very thoughtful comments about some of the contradictions and challenges that any religionist faces in a secular space, especially Singapore, which always aims to be progressive, trying to be at the leading edge of change, of modernity. But I will try to share a little bit with you, not just of my own thoughts of what we would like Singapore to look like in 2065, but share some thoughts that I've gathered from a project that Institute of Policy Studies organized in 2012. It was right after the general election of 2011 and the presidential election of 2011. And some commentators had said that Singaporeans as citizens have woken up as a political community, not a religious community, but as a political community. Singaporeans have suddenly woken up and have found their voices and want to engage their leaders, engage people who say they want to be leaders, and express their concerns, their points of view, and their aspirations. So I want to just zip through quickly what we have gathered, firstly from experts as well as leaders of 7 key sectors of Singapore. And then what we did was to take those views and share them publicly in a public exhibition. Not everybody, not all of Singapore came to that exhibition. Not everybody watched what we put on, but certainly we have some interesting views which I thought we'll use as a discussion starter for our Q&A later. So I really zipped through it very quickly. My project was called IPS Prism, and the key question is this: how will Singapore govern itself in 2022, 10 years after the last general election? And the focus is really, how will we, all of us, govern? Not how will the PAP, how will leaders govern Singapore? But the idea, back to Dr. Fatris' very thoughtful comments, is that we all have a part to play. We define what lies ahead. As much as the leadership establish what is the narrative cannot emerge just from the leadership, but from long history of wisdom. That's, again, thoughtful scholars, with an engagement of young people in Singapore, right? To try and discuss, well, what is the future? How do we interpret, how do we understand what is already established wisdom in a way that is responsive to the current realities and the aspirations of people. So ours is more limited, not 2065, 2022. And really the idea was to get people to pause and ponder, think deeply and widely about what are the choices that are ours to make. Okay? Of course, the end point we always say, because we are Singaporeans, is so that we can be an adaptive and resilient country. Pictures from the elections and an overview of the project. First part of the project was to ask people of 7 sectors: civil society, arts, culture and media, the academics, new citizens, business leaders, civil servants, as well as young Singaporeans. The question of what are the factors that will shape life in 2022 in Singapore. So the key thing to scenario planning exercises is not the scenarios. The key thing is a discussion about what are the most important driving forces that will bring us to that time horizon. In our case, 10 years. In your case, 50 years. So that is the heart and soul of thinking about the future. So we had 7 workshops for the 7 sectors, and in each workshop there are about 20 people, and we broke them up into groups of 4. Each of those groups of 4 came up with their own views of what those driving forces are. And then using those driving forces, talk about how those forces interact to create scenarios of Singapore. Then they took those scenarios to a big workshop where the people of the 7 workshops got together, shared their scenarios, and we said, okay, we develop afresh. Now that we have had views from all the different sectors, remember, different sectors have their different expertise. Different sectors know what are their special trends, right? If you are a business person, you know what are those business trends that you have to take into account. So when you get together in a broader group, you are able to share what is from your expertise. And we develop a fresh set of scenarios. So at the end of that whole process, we develop what we call the IPS Prism scenarios. And there are 3. Why? Remember, we had a discussion across the sectors, and then we democratically voted on what was the most plausible but challenging set of scenarios. So this is what they said. There are 3 key driving forces that they decided were the most important, most plausible, most challenging. First is the sense of credibility of the government. Whatever, it's not based on whether it's PAP or WP, but people's own sense of what the government is able to do. Whether we trust government or we don't trust government. Just like the gentleman from Sustainable Lab shared with you just now. In Silicon Valley, there's a general culture that people don't trust government to be too interventionist to fix things, especially if they do, it'll mess it up. Okay? So the first factor is whether people trust government, there's a high trust in government, or a low trust in government and what is able to do. The second driving force is society's definition of success. Right? As Dr. Fatris has discussed just now, this is a very important question. So what is the culture of Singaporeans at that time? Do they focus very much on the value of things, the dollar sign? Are they driven by that? Or are they, at the other end of the spectrum, more focused on values? What matters in life, right? Like Layong, Dr. Tan Layong shared, what matters in life for him is not entirely money actually. It's family and some life goals, doing good, right? So, value, dollar sign, or values. And the third driving force is whether as a society, whether as a system, whether as a people, we say it's important to distribute resources based on who are the winners. Because guess what? You put your best money on the brightest, the most promising social enterprise, the most promising business, you get your returns. And hopefully those returns will be redistributed, trickle down to everyone. Or in 10 years' time, do we arrive at a point where people say, no, actually, our starting point is we want everybody to have a minimal standard of living, minimal quality of life. You know, then it's a pro-common person world. We think of Scandinavia, right? Where the starting point is that if we can ensure that everybody has good childcare, good education, then that has a virtuous circle because they then have the capacity and capability to make their dreams come true. Some of them will translate into business, some of that will translate into social organizations, and so on and so forth. And then you arrive at the good society. So, in a nutshell, what happened is the group then took the different forces. Say, for instance, you start with high trust in government. You say the focus of society is really on the value, that means the material good, progress, and then hope that that would be redistributed by itself. Then you come to one story. The first story, which is our first scenario. We call it singastore.com. Why? Because in this scenario, Singapore in 2022 is very much driven by the market, trying to take advantage of market forces in order to progress and to be, in a way, wealthy enough to redistribute and help everybody as a second order effect. So the government is pro-business and the public focuses very much on the material, but they believe that that's what government does. That's what the market does. And when you distribute, then people can find their own solutions to happiness. So the question here is, if we want to have that kind of world, then how do we guarantee that we have social sustainability? That the outcome isn't one of very unequal society, that really winners are winners and everybody else is a loser. Okay? So that's the first story, singastore.com. The second story is called singagives.gov. Now, this is a story where there is, again, high trust in the role of government, but the focus is very much on values. And what kind of value? An egalitarian Singapore, where people feel the starting point is we must define who should get, we should define what sort of minimal good standard of living everybody should get. And if we get that, then we have a virtuous cycle of social and economic development. So in singagives.sg, we have a government which is very pro-people and redistributes reserves broadly. It nationalizes what we know now as government-linked companies or the MRT so that it can guarantee a minimum sort of cheap rides on the trains, cheap rides on buses, and so on and so forth. And the focus is very much on education and things like that. So you can see that here people care about social solidarity. But in this world, the question is, how do we ensure that Singapore is fiscally sustainable? Do you want to spend money? You hope that you have returns. That means everybody is lifted up to a higher level, whether it's education, skills, aspirations. But how do we make sure that it then translates to at least some economic progress, right? And we don't go broke. The third story is a very interesting one. We call it wikicity.sg. Wiki because this is a people-driven world. What does it mean? It's where there is actually low trust in government, low trust in what the government's able to do. Any government, doesn't matter, PAP or whatever, right? WP or whatever. And the focus is on values, but there are different values, different value communities. Can be religious, can be a pro-environment community that says, you know, I feel that we should really start our own schools that deal with climate change and start our own advocacy groups that shape legislation to deal with climate change. But at the same time in this world, you'll also have pro-business community, and you are not going to say they don't exist, nor they don't have a right to live. In this Wikicity world, the tolerance is much higher for all the different communities. So basically, you have a donut state. The government deals with foreign affairs, right, and national security, but it is, to use the word agnostic, it is agnostic about which community should have precedence over the other. So the rules are written so that you can do whatever you want to do. 6-star St. Regis style healthcare, since Layong talked about it just now, and free clinics, right? 6-star by the business Raffles group, free clinics by the Buddhist group, by the Muslim group, by the Christian groups. So it is a world that's very diverse. Now, the key question is, at the end of the day, will we consider ourselves all Singaporeans? Since we are all living in our separate worlds, and we think that we can thrive in those separate worlds. So that, in a nutshell, is what, well, I would say 140 people did, and then they took it, right? This is the Wikicity scenario. We took it to an exhibition. And we translated this into arts programs and things like that. And we asked people to come and view it, have their mind tickled by these ideas of the future. Okay, we got about 4,000 people to come. We also did a survey of their views, and I can share very quickly what they said. Okay, we only had 600 responses. But the responses are interesting because they came from the younger people. Okay, let me just fast forward. They came from younger people. They came from people who are in better housing type. Okay, so a bit more affluent, more Chinese, and more singles. All right, okay? But for people who study political attitudes like me, this group, younger, higher socioeconomic class, they tend to be the people who are change agents in politics. Possibly change agents in religious communities and many communities as well. So what did they say? I'm going to skip forward very quickly. We asked them one question. Now that you have heard our story of life in 2022, what is your story in life in 2022? So they wrote a whole narrative, paragraphs, and then we asked them, what did your story say about the following questions? Okay? So I'm going to go very quickly. One question. In your story, okay, or when they read the survey, it says, in my story of 2022, I will judge the government by whether it delivers economic growth. Remember our singerstore.com story? Improves well-being of people. Remember our singergives.sg story? Or gives freedom to people to do whatever they want to do, which is the wikicity.sg story. And they place themselves in that triangle. So this is a special survey, not multiple choice, but triangles, and you place yourself. So from this picture, you can see that at least our 600 people who are mainly change agents of Singapore, they are concerned not just of economic growth. If they mention economic growth, they want it to be mixed with well-being. But you can see a lot of people are in that area, between economic growth and well-being, or well-being, not just freedom for its own sake, right? Okay, so this is quite interesting. We asked one more question later on. In your opinion, not your story, I would like Singapore to be governed by, is it economic goals, moral values, or common sense? Okay, now for me, I'm not interested in all of the above kind of responses. That's like hedge your bets. But you can see that there's a lot of focus on moral values, or moral values and pragmatism. Okay? Now, what are some other questions that we asked? One question is, who should provide the basic goods of life? And here we find that a lot of responses are focused on government, right? Giving education, healthcare, and all that. And the desire is that it is distributed equally. Let me show you the picture. This is our response, right? The main provider of what I need should be, you see all the dots up there, government. Not business, not community. Okay? All right? So big government is still in fashion. But if you needed to choose who to give the help to, and we force people to choose, then who would you give it to? So you have the option of the needy, everyone equally, or people who contribute most to society. And you see the needy and everyone equally. Okay? All right, so I hope that gives you a flavor of what, okay, one more question. The government should help these people first, and we force them to choose. And you can see, right, it's between the youth and the elderly, but a lot of people cite the elderly. And I think you can see resonances of this in the last two budgets of the government, yeah. There's a need to respond to helping the elderly. So I've given you a flavor of what we found in our little project. I would just want to end with this question. Okay, in your story of 2022, what should the role of government be? is to help people help themselves, or pay for all basic needs, or subsidize. And you can see where our respondents were. See, somewhere between help people help themselves or subsidize some basic costs. Okay. I've got all that just in case you ask me hard questions, then I show you. And finally, in my story, the government should be one that supports new ideas or is rooted in tradition. So you can see a little bit more towards supporting new ideas. And finally, leadership in Singapore. Who should provide that? Is it the government or the community? And you can see people like to be in the center, both. So there is a shared role for community and for a duly elected government based on our stories, okay? So now I want to say that the findings are not generalizable, but for me it's interesting because it speaks of what the change agents in Singapore want. And let me just be fair and tell you that while I showed you only one set of scenarios, because that's the winning set, okay, there were many other scenarios and of course many driving forces that were cited. The top one has to do with identity and social cohesion. People are concerned whether we become a Singapore that is fragmented or whether we can still maintain social cohesion. It's linked also very much to the question of whether in the way that we do our economy, we will help people progress, or whether Singapore will become a world where there are 3 winners and everybody else is a loser. So that's very important to social cohesion and many other factors, as you can see. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I think that you will have many, many questions. Some of those questions will be, what are really the factors that will precipitate social change? And then the onus is on you. Now that you have identified those factors of change, what is your role as a young citizen? What is your role in shaping the future of 2065, right? Okay, all right. I'll leave it at that and pass the time back to the chairperson. Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for both amazing speakers. Right? Dr. Gillian Koh, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Dr. Fatris, thank you so much as well. I'm just going to skip the entire moderator's question and just throw the mic to the floor. You've heard a lot, you've digested a lot. Who wants to ask the first question? Please go ahead. Can we have mics? To Muhammad over here. Okay. We'll take 2 questions.
I have 2 questions. One for Dr. Gillian Koh and one for the Mufti. Alright, my first question is directed to Dr. Gillian Koh. Just now from the triangles, we have seen that the youth of Singapore who participated in that event were putting more emphasis on moral values and helping the elderly on the quality of life. So my question is, in the next 10 or 50 years, do you think Singapore, the government of Singapore, the way it's being governed, will put more emphasis on quality of life? And if whether this will happen or not, do we move on with the structure that we have, or do we remodel on countries like, regions like Scandinavia? That's my first question. My second question is for Dr. Fatris Bahkaram, the Mufti of Singapore. Sorry, bersama. You mentioned that the aspirations of the youth, like we are having a much more younger religious community. So, and as such, the aspirations of the youth will definitely contradict with the traditions of the elderly, of what we have. And and as you can see, the next 50 years, the youth are becoming more secular, more inclusive, more liberal, because of this, of where we are living, Singapore. So, what is the future of religion in Singapore? Do we reform or do we revive, especially in terms of minorities such as the LGBT groups? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I think that Singapore will be what we make it. I think that's the starting point. We always imagine that Singapore is what PAP will make it, or Lee Kuan Yew will make it, or Goh Chok Tong will make it, or Lee Hsien Loong will make it. But in truth, I think if we look at things, we will find that they have also had to respond to what people are saying, and that Singapore is governed not just by the ballot box during the general elections, but there are always many, many, many occasions where the leaders, community leaders as well as political leaders, are constantly trying to meet the ground, have discussions, public consultation exercises, right? This time around we had our Singapore conversation. And of course you have REACH, People's Association, so on and so forth. The fact is that over the past 2 years, as I've mentioned, we have seen the government not just say that it wants to change the social compact between people and state, right? State can be run by WP and SP, it doesn't matter, whatever is the government that is of the day. But really, how do we, as individuals, then interact with the macro level state? So the PAP government has said that it wanted to change the social compact between people and the state. What does this translate to? It has translated to, in the indirect fashion, far more subsidies to ensure that the people who are from the disadvantaged groups right up to 30th percentile get more help than they've ever had. This is in the area of more subsidies for housing, more subsidies for healthcare, so that the MediShield, MediSave can cover more ailments, more medicines, more help for childcare. Now you see that, in fact, if you're a business person running a childcare, you'll be, hiya, how can government dictate what kind of fees I can charge? Is this communist China? But in fact, what the government has done is to say, if you want to be an anchor operator of a childcare, or now a partnership operator, I will actually give you the real estate at a subsidized price. I will make the cost of your business of running a childcare cheaper, as long as you put a cap on the fees you charge. So that is highly interventionist if you were a pure capitalist model. But you've seen the government do more subsidies. That is indirect. But we've also seen more direct help. That means actually money in your pocket for the poor and the disadvantaged, up to 30% income, up to 60 even. How? You see that the government sort of given more money now through workfare. If you work as a low-wage worker, the government tops up, right, your income through cash and CPF, up to the equivalent of 3 months' worth of your wages, right? Okay, that's fine. If you don't care workfare, never mind. Now you actually have improved interest rates on CPF, which means your retirement funds will grow. But never mind, this year's budget, the big bang measure, is something called silver support. So as you know, there will be the elderly who at the time when they worked, if they worked, $300 a month was a big deal. In fact, $200 a month in the 1970s to the 80s was a lot. But translated to today's price level, it's nothing. So the government has actually taken bitten the bullet and actually said, we actually will give transfer payment. It's literally money in your hand so that you can cope. Yes, some people will say $350 up to $700 per quarter is not a lot. But it's a step in the right direction, and it required almost a change of religion for PAP, which has been pragmatic because afraid of people taking advantage, that has been market-based, that says you have to work. How can you get money for free? That's completely changed now. Finally, the GST vouchers. This has been in place for a long time, but it is directed at the poor and disadvantaged, probably up to the 30th percentile, where they can get, again, really money off the bat, cash, money vouchers to cover their utilities, right? And CPF top-ups, yeah. So you can see that it is never black or white, but it is a movement towards certainly talking about what is the quality of life we want all Singaporeans to enjoy, and further help for the people at the bottom to level them up. The next step, if you wanted to be Scandinavia, is to say, sorry, we scrap everything, and we say everybody must have free childcare, free education, free everything, and then you stuck on that basis. That's fine, as long as then you get good financial accountants who can tell you, how can you sustain it? You can sustain it for first 5 years. Sustain it for 7 years. Then you have to raise the taxes, or you have to really, you go broke. I mean, it's just a fact of life, that's all. Yeah. Unless you can wait 10 years where everybody is now a Steve Jobs. Create an Apple of your own, create Instagram, Twitter, and we have such a lot of economic success that it becomes a virtuous cycle. Then you have plenty to distribute. Well, you have to take a chance. And a lot of politicians, by the time they reach 7 years and the kitty is broke, they'll say, I don't need to run for elections, let the next group take over. Then they'll be, how am I going to find the money in there? So I think all of us will have to think long term, like you are doing the next 50 years, and consider what is sustainable over the long term. Okay?